Alright, you guys. So for this week, we have a decent number of readings, although most of them are very short, in that On Being Brought from Africa to America, for example, is only 8 lines long. Pilgrimage is just over a page with a lot of spacing, and then Girl is not quite a page, although not with much spacing. And then A Pair of Tickets is a short story, normal short story kind of length. But overall, we have 4 readings that are all in some way dealing with family relationships and or heritage, whether that is an individual heritage or the heritage of a family or the heritage of a group. That's how all of these this week tie together. So I'm going to start with A Pair of Tickets, then I'll go through Girl, then Pilgrimage, then On Being Brought from Africa to America, so the order they're listed in the syllabus. And after I kind of discuss each work, I will explain the response for that work. So there are going to be 4 separate response questions, one for each work that I do want you to answer, but that can all be done in one answer, whether that's a document that you're attaching or if you're just typing directly in. Just make it clear, this is your Pair of Tickets response, this is your Girl response, etc. Hopefully it wouldn't be that complicated to tell anyway, but just do them in order and that will be easy. So, like I said, we'll start with A Pair of Tickets. So A Pair of Tickets is actually part of a longer novel. The novel is called The Joy Luck Club. It's Amy Tan, our author. It's her best known work. And the novel is about 4 Chinese female immigrants and their daughters. So this is part of the section that is about Junmei and her mother. And this particular section is in some ways autobiographical to Amy Tan in that, like Junmei, she was born and grew up in California. She had never been to China. Her parents were indeed both Chinese, but she felt American, Californian, etc., and had never really felt connected with her Chinese heritage until she took her first trip to China, which was around the same age that Junmei is in the story. So that all kind of ties together. So there's a lot going on in this story, but I'm just going to focus on just a little bit in going through this kind of summary. So Junmei is in China to meet her older sisters. Her mother, when she lived in China, had been married and gave birth to twin daughters who, during the war, she had to leave on the side of the road. She was positive she was going to die. And as it turns out, if she hadn't, she did just collapse on the road. And if a group of people had not come along and picked her up and gotten her into a wagon and gotten her water and food, she would have died on the road. But by the time she was conscious and knew what was going on, they were too far away to go back and get her daughters. She had left them with pictures of her family. She had left everything she had, money, jewels, anything that was worth anything, with the babies in hopes that that would encourage whoever found them to take care of them. And she'd also given them the address of her family in the city in hopes that they would find them, and after things were safe, they would be brought to the city. As it turns out, they were found and they were raised by very kind people. The house in the city that her family lived in was bombed and none of them survived. So there was no one to bring them to, even if that had been something that was tried. But Junmei's mother has looked for these girls for the rest of her life. She has written letters to friends all over China. She has tried as hard as she can to locate them. And finally, a school friend of hers recognized these 2 faces as looking somewhat like Junmei's mother, who she had known when she was young. And she just took the chance to ask them if they happened to have the names of the sisters. They did. She was able to give them Junmei's mother's address. They wrote to her. but the letter arrived just very, very shortly after she had died. So she had spent her whole life looking for them, and ultimately they were found just after she had died. So rather than meeting their mother, who they've always, of course, wanted to meet, they're meeting their little sister, who they didn't even know they had, but they think it's great. And they're meeting Junmei's father, who again is not their father. Their father also died in the war. That's part of why Junmei's mother was escaping. So that is why Junmei is in China, is to meet these sisters. She does end up meeting a good deal of her father's family as well, but the primary purpose of the trip is to meet her sisters. And the very beginning of the story, our speaker, so Junmei, tells us that she finally feels Chinese. That physically being in the country and connecting with it in that way is what is finally making her feel like she does have some connection to her heritage, which her mother always told her she would find at some point, even though she continually said, Junmei, continually said that she didn't feel Chinese and felt no connection with the culture. So it's something that her mother had always told her, and now she's seeing it happen. Also seeing how the country and being in the country affected her father, meeting his family and seeing how that affected him, that all also absolutely had an impact on her. And then, of course, ultimately meeting her sisters. All of that made her feel a sense of connection with her Chinese heritage that she had never felt before. So that is a very, very brief kind of summary of a little bit of the events, or at least the impetus behind the events, and then just a quick look at some of the parts that do relate to familial relationships and sense of heritage. So my response question I would like you guys to think about and respond to for A Pair of Tickets is, so Junmei's mother's name means long cherished wish. We were told that in the middle of the story by the father. How is the very end of the story appropriate to this name? So when I say the very end of the story, I mean like the last page of the story, and the things that are happening in that. How does that relate to a long cherished wish on the part of the mother? So that's the question I'd like you to answer for A Pair of Tickets. Again, at the very end of the video, I'll go back over all 4 of the questions. But yes, the mother's name means long cherished wish. How is the very end of the story appropriate for this name? That is the question. All right. I could try to do some kind of transition, but I'm just going to jump right into Girl. Again, all of these readings are very closely related, so I'm not really jumping so much as just moving to the next work. So Girl, written by Jamaica Kincaid, which is actually a pen name she took for herself later in life. She grew up in Antigua in the Caribbean, but she was sent to New York to earn her living when she was 17 years old, and she stayed in the US after that. She was in New York for a long time. She did eventually marry and move to somewhere else up in the Northeast, but stayed in that area. When she was very young, she actually had a very good relationship with her mother, but that had already deteriorated by the time she had left for New York. Partially, her mother had remarried and had much younger children who Jamaica was left to take care of a lot and raise a lot, and therefore the relationship that she had once had with her mother was a different one. Those younger siblings had more of that kind of supportive relationship, whereas Jamaica was moving more into a caretaking relationship. That is a very, very abbreviated piece that is not in any way like the entirety of their relationship, but that's just a little piece of it. As far as what we have in Girl, this isn't just one conversation or tirade that's happening. This is Kincaid writing in a way where she is just listing or bursting actually memories of instruction she had received from her mother. Some of it's useful, some of it's helpful, some of it's practical, some of it's a little hurtful. And maybe a little hurtful is putting it a little mildly, but I suppose it just depends on your perspective on that. So she's just, we see that with the style of the way this is being written, she's kind of mimicking that this kind of instruction or pestering or whatever we want to call it has been kind of peppered at her entire life. She's always being told what to do, given some instruction, some piece of advice, something she must follow. And she very rarely gets to respond to it or get a word in. Those few little sections of the story that are in italics are meant to be the girl's voice kind of responding to the mother voice and what the mother was saying. So yeah, we see all sorts of different kinds of advice. We do see that ultimately we return over and over again to this idea of the mother being terrified that her daughter is going to be a slut, and therefore trying to remind her of all the things she should do and can do to make sure that that doesn't happen. So in response to this, I do kind of want to compare it a little bit to what we see going on in A Pair of Tickets. So as opposed to A Pair of Tickets, what we have here is a speaker reflecting back on pieces of her heritage from her childhood. In A Pair of Tickets, of course, we have someone trying to build heritage as an adult. Something that we do have in common here is that both of our speakers are illustrating a complicated relationship with both their mothers and with their heritage. In A Pair of Tickets, we see over the course of the story, we see Junmei able to kind of reconcile both the difficulties of her relationship with her mother and some of the feelings she had about really not understanding or feeling her heritage, where we seem to have her kind of coming to peace with everything over the course of the story. So my response question to you about Girl is, does our speaker in Girl seem to come to a peaceful resolution or conclusion about her relationship with her mother and her relationship to her heritage as she writes? And then why do you think she does, or why do you think she does not? So again, the question is, does the speaker in Girl seem to come to a peaceful understanding of her mother, their relationship, and her heritage, specifically as it has come to her through this instruction of her mother? And why or why not? So just explain your answer. All right, so that is Girl. And we move on to our first poem, which is Pilgrimage by Natasha Trethewey. So the pilgrimage that is being discussed in this poem is to Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg, Mississippi was under siege for 40 days by the Union forces before the Confederate or Southern forces ultimately surrendered to the Union, led by Ulysses S. Grant, who would later become president of the U.S. On July 4th, 1863. This was a huge turning point in the Civil War. This was a big loss for the Confederacy, and it helped to bring things to a close much more quickly than they had been heading toward. And what we have here is the speaker reflecting on the experiences of those who lived during those who lived during the siege, those who lived in Vicksburg. Specifically, she thinks about the women who were kind of just sitting there. They're not fighting, they're just stuck. But also on the commercialization of the defeat that still exists to this day. And I say that still exists to this day because this is 100% my personal experience with Vicksburg. This is not anyone else's opinion on Vicksburg. This is not some official position. This is just me. I went to Vicksburg, and this is how I felt. It is a very sad town. It is living on the memory of these Confederate soldiers and the civilians who remained in the city during the siege, and kind of their strength. And we'll talk about that as it is problematic in a moment, but it is, to me, what I experienced there, again, personally, was just a place very strongly living in the past, and living in a past that is sad and is upsetting, and not living in a past and being able to reflect on some sort of success or happiness, but just perpetually upset about something that happened, 150 something years ago. And again, that's my personal take on Vicksburg. But as far as what we have being reflected by Trethewey in the poem, so again, she really is focusing on the commercialization. She's staying in a bed and breakfast that's one of the old mansions that, some major family would have lived in. And it's marketing itself as living history. And that's a history that ultimately the speaker feels trapped by. Those last couple lines of the poem, she feels as though history has rolled over on her and she can't get out from under it. And so it's as though the entire city, town, whatever, is kind of taken over by this historic ghost that won't leave and won't let you move on, in a sense. So I said we would get into some of the problematicness of this place, and here we are. So yeah, this town's tourism is based on a lengthy siege that was ultimately a defeat of the Confederate or Southern forces by the Union and Northern forces. However, a good deal of the focus tends to be on the bravery of the Southern forces as they held out for these 40 days, rather than on the result, which was a defeat of the Southern forces, which was a victory for the Northern forces. So here's my question, and I think of all the questions I'm going to ask you today, this one might be the most complicated and the most difficult to answer, but it is incredibly relevant considering we have lots of conversation going on right now about removing Confederate monuments. This is a town that is essentially one big Confederate monument. Again, my personal opinion. And so, yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. But just based on this little bit of knowledge that I've given you about Vicksburg, which is a tiny little bit about the battle, the siege, and my opinions about its current state. And then based on what you're seeing the speaker of the poem reflect on with her own experience of being there. Here are my questions. So is it possible to market this type of experience without being inherently racist? And is it possible to honor the lives of those who were lost in the siege, even though they gave their lives in the name of the Southern cause, which is another word for slavery? And explain your answer. So again, those two questions that I'm asking are, is it possible to market this type of experience that is being marketed in Vicksburg without being inherently racist? Yes or no, and explain why you think that. And then, is it possible to honor the lives of those who were lost in the siege, even though they gave their lives in the name of the Southern cause and the Southern cause is simply another word for slavery in this case. Again, yes or no, and explain. So I'm definitely very interested to see what you guys have to say about this in the next poem. I do encourage you guys to use those discussion boards I put up. They are not a required part of your grade. As I mentioned, I put up a post about kind of struggling with making that a part of your grade or not, and ultimately deciding not to. But I would really be interested in seeing you all interact with each other and not just with me. Obviously, these videos, you're just getting a chance to hear me talking. We're not having a conversation. And when you turn in your work, it's to me, and you and I can have a conversation, which is fantastic. But to me, the best parts about this class when we meet in person are absolutely the discussions that happen between students. And that's, of course, always maintaining civility and kindness toward one another and respect. And I would expect to see those same things on the discussion board, of course. But I do definitely recommend, if this is something you have a strong feeling about in any way, I would really like to see those responses on the discussion board as well. Again, as an optional part of the class. Okay, so we have one poem left, and this is by Phillis Wheatley, and it's called On Being Brought from Africa to America. So Phillis Wheatley, she was taken from her home in Africa, and I say Africa simply because we do not know what country. She was so young that she doesn't remember. Well, she didn't remember, and we don't know. And sold into the slave trade in America before she was 6 years old. She was owned by a wealthy family in Boston. She was educated, and she also learned about Christianity and converted. So while she may have had some atypical experiences of a slave in America, she is a slave in America. She was taken violently, undoubtedly, from her home and crammed onto an overcrowded ship and then sold to another human being. That still happened to her, regardless of the fact that then she learned to read and write. She is the first African-American published in the US. She was also published in England. And she wrote a lot of poetry. And if you like this poem and you like her ideas, I definitely recommend looking into more Phillis Wheatley poetry. It's fantastic. Unfortunately, there's not a lot in this book, but I have a whole book probably in my office where I won't be all semester, but it might be here at home. I don't know. If you just go to Google and type in Phillis Wheatley poetry, you'll find plenty. This is her most well-known poem, but there's a lot. There are a lot of others, and they are excellent. Anyway, so this poem's only 8 lines long, but it is packed with a lot of important ideas and a lot of things to think about. So the first 4 lines are telling kind of the portion of her story I've already told, explaining that she once knew nothing about Christianity, but now she both understands it and seeks redemption for her soul. So she was taken as she phrases it, she was brought from Africa to America, and in doing so, learned about Christianity and has become a Christian. Okay. The last 4 lines, though, speak specifically to white Christians. And it's reminding them that as Christians, they can't hold a belief that Africans are intrinsically different or below them in some way. Because in God's eyes, she and the rest of her race are able to seek redemption. They can become saved, and their souls can and will eternally reside in heaven, just as the souls of these white Christians can and may. And so we see a very sharp reminder to her white audience of how they need to be acting based on what they say they supposedly believe in. And I love her poetry for this. We will see her in many poems do things like the first 4 lines might make a white American, feel good. It's like, oh, look, this poor girl wouldn't have known Christianity if it weren't for us. But then the last 4 lines really have to remind them yeah, like, this is how I know about Christianity, but I know so much about Christianity that, by the way, you're not doing it right. You can't call yourself a Christian and also believe in slavery. It doesn't work. If you can acknowledge that I can learn about Christianity and my soul can be saved, and you can celebrate that, then you also have to acknowledge that it doesn't matter what body that soul is in, and therefore you're doing your Christianity wrong, if you are also agreeing with slavery. So, great poems by her, like I said. So my response activity, my question for you guys for this poem, again, a pretty difficult one. So these last two poems bring up a lot of issues that have always been relevant in our lifetimes, but perhaps are a little more at the forefront of the media, and more people are willing to try to have conversations about these topics right now, so making them more relevant in the public eye, I suppose. They've always been relevant, but so is it difficult? No, not is it. It is difficult to reconcile the positive side of being brought that the speaker explains with the extreme violence and systematic racism of the slave trade. So can you agree with the speaker that, in her words, 'twas mercy that brought her to America? Why or why not? So again, she was brought to America under the auspices of the slave trade, which is an inherently violent and, I'm sorry, my computer's doing something weird. Okay. An inherently violent and problematic issue. Sorry, I sort of lost my train of thought there, you guys. Again, my computer was doing some pop-up thing. Anyway, however, she starts her poem by saying that 'twas mercy that brought her to America, because it exposed her to Christianity, taught her to embrace the savior of her soul, to embrace God, to embrace Jesus, etc. So that is her reconciliation, is that what she got was Christianity. So yeah, can you agree that it was merciful for her to be brought because of what she got, or is what happened to her too much for it to be merciful in any way? So that's the end of the readings for today. So again, I will very quickly, I know this video is very long, and I appreciate you for sticking with me. I will very quickly just go over the 4 questions again. So for A Pair of Tickets, my question is, the mother's name means long cherished wish. How is the very end of the story appropriate for her name? For Girl, in both A Pair of Tickets and Girl, we see a speaker who has some difficulty or some complicated relationship with her mother and her heritage. In A Pair of Tickets, we see the speaker working through that and coming to a peace by the end of the story. Do you think the speaker in Girl also has worked through those issues and come to some sort of peace? And why or why not? For Pilgrimage, I have 2 questions here. So is it possible to market this type of experience, and by this type of experience, I mean this somber reflection on the siege of Vicksburg, without being inherently racist? And is it possible to honor the lives of those who were lost in the siege, even though they gave their lives in the name of the Southern cause of slavery? And again, explain your answer. And then for On Being Brought from Africa to America, so she, it is difficult to reconcile the positive side of being brought that the speaker explains with the extreme violence and systematic racism of the slave trade. Can you agree with the speaker that 'twas mercy that brought her to America? Why or why not? So those are our response questions for this week. Those are just a little look at our readings for this week. Again, I know this is a long video. Thank you for sticking with it, and do feel free, and I really do encourage you to chime in on the discussion board if there are any of these readings that have sparked something interesting in you. And thank you guys. I will talk to you later and hope to hear from you this week.